Well, on behalf of the University of Iowa, the Provost's Office of Outreach and Engagement, and the Grant Wood Art Colony, I would like to welcome you to the 5th Biennial Grant Wood Symposium. My name is Maura Pilcher, and I'm the director of the Grant Wood Art Colony. I am thrilled to be kicking off what will absolutely be a fabulous celebration of Grant Wood's life and legacy. We have a very full program, so without further delay, I'd like to introduce the University of Iowa's provost and also a great champion of Grant Wood, Barry Butler.
Well, thank you, and welcome to everybody. On behalf of President Bruce Harold and the rest of the University of Iowa administration, it's great to see you all out here this evening. This is going to be a wonderful symposium. I know from looking at the program it's going to be outstanding, and so I look forward to the various talks and interactions that we have throughout the weekend. For those of you that it's your first time here, as Maura said, this is the 5th that we've had, and the first was held actually in May of 2009 under tents on the lawn of Grant Wood's former house over at 1142 East Court Street in Iowa City, now owned by Iowa City lawyer Jim Hayes back here in the audience, and a very avid art collector as well, and a champion for the Grant Wood Art Colony. Jim had acquired some property neighboring it and had the vision to do something with it and to sort of recognize Grant Wood as part of this, and had conversations with my predecessor as well as others in the central administration. And out of that, like a lot of great things, you talk about it and you figure things out, came what we have today as the Grant Wood Art Colony. And again, for those of you that aren't familiar with that, basically what we have there is a colony inspired by Grant Wood's view of art colonies, but it has a little bit more to it than that. The mission is to provide a creative home for the next generation of artists and continue Grant Wood's creative advocacy in the School of Art and Art History and the Division of Performing Arts at the University of Iowa through artistic residencies, teaching fellowships, symposia, and community programs. So tonight obviously is helping to fulfill that mission, and again for the 5th time. We started in 2011 with 1 fellow, and it expanded to 2 a year or 2 later, and now we have 3 fellows. The original fellow was in painting, drawing, and now we have one in interdisciplinary performance, which rotates through theater, music, and dance. So we've had an alumni group of 17 fellows who've participated in this program over the years. I've mentioned to Jim and others involved in this. Over the years, this group of people who come to this campus basically for the academic year are going to continue to be part of the legacy of this program. We're attracting some incredible artists. They are returning back for some of the alumni events, I'll call them that, alumni events, and they're becoming bigger and bigger names in the world of art as they leave here and go on. As many of you know, they take up residency in the homes that are part of the colony. They teach a course for us, which is great for the University of Iowa because our students get a chance to interact with these wonderful artists while they're on campus. And most importantly, and this was part of really looking at this outreach piece, thanks to Associate Provost Linda Snetzler, who's sitting up front here, developed really a way to get them out into the community, and Maura as well, I think, in terms of getting them out around the state. And so we have the fellows going out and doing various programs throughout the state of Iowa, reaching out to school children, reaching out to museums throughout the state. And then part of that program then brings the richness of this colony and what its mission is all about, not just to Iowa City, but to the rest of the state of Iowa and beyond as well. And so, you know, a couple of weeks ago, or months ago, I should say, Maura spoke at one of our Lunch and Learns. This is an opportunity where we take some of our best people out into the community to give a lunchtime lecture, a Lunch and Learn. And we had one where Maura was our speaker, and she had a quote from this. It said, "Engaging the next generation of artists is truly important to continuing Grant Wood's legacy." And that's really what the residency program is all about. We have a wonderful, wonderful program planned tonight and tomorrow. It's a great opportunity to really celebrate what is coming up, the 125th anniversary of Grant Wood's birth, and so that's kind of a special time as well. And we have a terrific lineup of presenters starting tonight. So I want to give a special thank you to tonight's speaker, Professor Erica Doss from the University of Notre Dame, and then also to others in the audience who help us with the colony. We have wonderful support. I know a lot of the board members are here. They met earlier today and really, really help us a lot to kind of move this along in the right direction. And there's nothing but a great future ahead of us. So with no further ado, I want to turn the podium over to Joni Kinsey. Joni will introduce our speaker, and Joni's a wonderful, she told me not to introduce her beyond her name, but a wonderful faculty member here at the University of Iowa, and really appreciate everything she's been doing for us as well. So Joni, why don't you come on up?
Well, thank you so much. Welcome to all of you. I'm delighted to see so many in the audience and welcome you to the opening event of our biennial symposium. And it's especially exciting this year because, as we just heard, this is the 125th anniversary of Grant Wood's birth. So we've had a number of exciting events this year, and this is the culmination to all of it. We've had the theme semester last spring, which was, the theme was Just Living, and that was carried out in all kinds of events all over campus. We had an exhibition at the University of Iowa Museum of Art, which included Grant Wood's work, that essentially kind of tried to do him justice and talk about how he did justice to many different things. We had a graduate seminar in our department on Grant Wood and regionalism this past spring as well. There was a project for K through 12 children, school children, to do birthday cards, art birthday cards for Grant Wood. There was a Grant Wood Legacy Awards program at the UI Bell and Blank Center for Gifted Education, and a summer art share camp for children, and a number of different series of special lectures. And so this is really the culmination to a whole year of celebration of Grant Wood's his birthday. Well, I'm very pleased this evening to have the honor of introducing tonight's keynote speaker, Professor Erica Doss. Professor Doss is one of the leading scholars in American art history and visual culture today, and we're really fortunate to welcome her back to Iowa City. For those of you who have seen the recent documentary called Mural: The Making of a Modern Masterpiece about our Jackson Pollock painting here at the university, Erica will be a familiar face, and she's been in a number of other documentary films about American art. Erica Doss received her PhD at the University of Minnesota in 1983, and since 2007 has been a professor in the departments of American Studies and Art History and Design at the University of Notre Dame. Before that, she was at the University of Colorado at Boulder and Cleveland State University, and she's had 2 Fulbright Awards to Denmark and Australia. There is not time to do sufficient justice to her entire body of work. Her CV extends to 41 pages. But to suffice it to say, her scholarly work is both distinguished and unusually varied, and it thrives at the intersection of art and popular culture. She's the author of 7 books and over 100 articles and book chapters, which range from titles, and these are the book titles: Memorial Mania, Public Feeling in America, Looking at Life magazine, Elvis Culture, Fans, Faith, and Image, Spirit Poles and Flying Pigs, Public Art and Cultural Democracy in American Communities, and Benton Pollock and the Politics of Modernism, from regionalism to abstract expressionism. She's also written a couple of textbooks, one on 20th century American art, and she has a forthcoming book on American art of the 20th and 21st centuries from Oxford University Press. And she has 2 books in progress, one called Spiritual Moderns, 20th Century American Artists and Religion, and I Am America, Art, Belief, and Ultra-Patriotism During the Great Depression. Erica's work has strong ties to Iowa, and she has a forthcoming article in the Getty Research Journal about our Jackson Pollock painting entitled Mural. and she has a long association with art of the Midwest, including Grant Wood. Her talk tonight, which is entitled Screwball Regionalism, Grant Wood and Humor During the Great Depression, will, I have no doubt, be illuminating, insightful, and very entertaining. Please help me welcome Erica Doss.
Hi, everybody. Can everybody hear me? Yes, okay. And if you can't, just wave your hands in the back and scream or something. I'm flattered and very honored to present the opening lecture at the Grant Wood Colony's 5th Biennial Symposium this evening, which this year follows the theme of myth, memory, and the Midwest, Grant Wood and beyond. So that phrase, and beyond, I'm gonna go back to these glasses, prompted me to think about these guys. Sort of Buzz Lightyear, Toy Story feel to it. Buzz, as you recall, was the fearless, funny, slightly moronic space ranger in that Disney Pixar franchise, which I think is a perfect segue for my focus tonight on Grant Wood and the subject of humor during the Great Depression. It took me hours to find this, by the way, but I knew there was one out there and I finally found it. Not surprisingly, Toy Story characters Buzz and Jessie have been in at least one, probably many more, American Gothic spoofs. Grant Wood's paintings have long been seen as humorous, and he himself was an engaged humorist. Consider the response to his iconic 1930 painting, the one that really put him on the visual map of American art. If some saw a straightforward or realistic portrait of a Midwestern farm couple and responded accordingly as to whether or not they felt that this was sympathetic or offensive, Wood veered toward aesthetic caricature, understanding humor as a trait or an attribute that was central to the Midwestern regional and especially the American national character that he depicted. As Byron McKeeby, the dentist who posed for the farmer in American Gothic, related in 1935, he, Grant Wood, told me that he wanted a face showing integrity from a man with a sense of humor, who would not rebel at the distortion that might be necessary to carry out his theme. The painting was in no manner intended to be a portrait. Likewise, Wood remarked that his intention with Daughters of Revolution, a picture that Carol Ann Marling once described as 3 Iowa matrons who would, quote, faint dead away at the mere mention of a revolution, was similarly humorous, and that the painting was done, as he put it, in fun rather than in anger. A look through the scrapbooks that Grant Wood's sister Nan kept, which are wonderfully digitalized and all online through the Figge Art Museum in Davenport, thank you, shows frequent use of the words fun, laughs, satire, and humor in articles from the 1930s discussing Grant Wood's paintings. So what did humor mean in 1930s America? And what did Grant Wood find funny? What were the sources and the subjects of his humor during the era of the Great Depression, and how and why were they conveyed? Tonight, I'd like to explore these questions and Grant Wood's sense of humor, arguing that it was specific to the emotional and social needs of the era, and that as such, it fell flat when those needs and America's sense of humor changed in the early 1940s. I'm indebted to Wanda Korn and to James Dennis for their prior writing on this subject, and I aim to expand on their scholarship by linking Wood's sense of humor with ideas about national myth and national myth making during the Great Depression. The These ideas were especially expounded by cultural historian Constance Rourke, whose 1931 book, American Humor, A Study of the National Character, was a national bestseller. Responding, like many interwar intellectuals, to critical assertions that America was a cultural backwater, devoid of history, obsessed with making money. We could make a commentary today, but I won't. Rourke wrote that America was actually a nation of highly self-conscious myth makers, and that humor was at the core of its exuberance and underlying unity. Humor has been a fashioning instrument in America, she wrote, cleaving its way through the national life, holding tenaciously to the spread elements of that life. Humor was both a practice of self-criticism, fostered by democratic principles, and one of national critique, focused on sustaining those democratic principles. Locating a middle ground of popular American humor in the comedic figures of the Yankee, the frontiersman, a category that included legends like Mike Fink, a brawling river boatman, and the minstrel, Constance Rourke argued that a distinctive American character had evolved against a background of a still forming nation. None of these comic types, she stressed, were real. They were characters, actors on a national stage, wearing masks and performing how to be American, including performing the complexities of American identity on race, class, and gendered terms. Rourke's ideas about the performativity of American character meshed with Grant Wood's ideas and his visual attentiveness to how Americans performed and presented themselves in history and myth, most notably in highly theatrical paintings like Parson Weems' Fable. His theatrical interests were long-standing. He painted backdrops for school plays at McKinley Junior High School in Cedar Rapids, where he taught from 1922 to 1926. And he designed sets and hosted amateur theater productions in his studio at 5 Turner Alley. He painted theater curtains framing an exaggerated Midwestern landscape. Now, I don't know if you can see this, but on the left, there is a man, a male hiker, posing on a rock. And on the right, we see a buck with an impressive rack of antlers posing on that right side. And this is all on the side of an ice wagon that he lived in while teaching at the Stone City Art Gallery, or Art Colony, rather. It's a little strange. The Art Colony's performative atmosphere, Daryl Garwood at one point called it circus-like, included lining up the decorated ice wagons like a giant billboard or an outdoor mural, and selling art that was made by the colonists at public auctions, which Grant Wood advertised in local newspapers and which drolly imitated the drama of the farm foreclosures all over America during the Great Depression. So what we're seeing here is a contrast between a farm foreclosure ad from about 1936 on the left and one of Grant Wood's ads on the right. Some 3,000 people showed up at the Stone City Art Colony auction in August of 1932, all in on the joke that offered, quote, 27 head sheep, hogs, horses, cattle, and squirrels cast in plaster, and 10 red barns, some with silos, windmills, and outbuildings rendered in oil and watercolor. Also a band concert. Playing to the Midwestern audience that he knew well and probably knew best, Grant Wood made and offered American art on performative terms that were spiked with humor. Constance Rourke understood humor, American humor, as myth, legend, fable, and fantasy, and she used all of those words interchangeably. She further refused conceptual categories of high and low in deference to a cultural hybridity that she called American vagaries, and Gilbert Seldes, her contemporary, called America's lively arts, a unique blend of vaudeville, comic books, movies, jazz, and other forms of popular culture. The objective of American humor, said Constance Rourke, was to create, quote, fresh bonds, a new unity, the semblance of a society, and the rounded completion of an American type. American humor, she added, was nomadic and unfinished, like the nation itself. It was, as Greil Marcus wrote in a 2004 reissue of Rourke's book, America declaring over and over to closed ears, even its own, that it did exist. A shout, a whisper, a con game, a practical joke, nothing more and nothing less. Rourke's idea of humor as a distinctively American habit of self-criticism and a defining aspect of the nation's democratic persona as a performative shout-out to America's enduring and incomplete or unfinished existence segued neatly with Grant Wood's sense of humor as a visual tool of national, not just regional, discernment. As he stated in 1930, the people in American Gothic are American, and it is unfair to localize them to Iowa. Bear in mind, too, that he titled his best-known painting American Gothic, not Midwestern Gothic or Iowa Gothic. Importantly, both Rourke and Wood made distinctions between humor and ridicule. They understood humor as something that poked fun and prompted laughter among those to whom it was directed, with the objective of changing attitudes about particular subjects. However irreverent, their sense of humor was based in unity and reform. Humor exposed and deflated America's follies in order to advance a more sensible state. As Gertrude Stein purportedly said, we should fear Grant Wood. Every artist and every school of artists should be afraid of him for his devastating satire, which, Gertrude Stein explained, was more creative and constructive than destructive. Although Wood himself shrugged off that word satire, worried that some might interpret it as derisive ridicule, he explained his use of humor on similarly constructive terms. Writing about American Gothic, I did not intend this painting as a satire. I endeavored to paint these people as they existed for me in the life I knew. It seems to me that they are basically sound and good people. But I don't feel that one gets at this fact better by denying their faults and fanaticism. Likewise, in paintings like Daughters of Revolution and Parson Weems' Fable, he poked fun at reflexive patriotism, at the dangers to American democracy of unchecked, unthinking allegiances. Wood's humor, in other words, was not on par with the satirical barbs that wits like H.L. Mencken directed against the American bourgeoisie in the 1920s, an acerbic kind of comic assault that purposely angered and alienated his targets, leaving them feeling marginalized from a larger American body politic. Grant Wood was no Mencken. Grant Wood's humor was intended to inspire, not incense. And as such, it corresponded with mainstream understandings of humor as an instructional tool and a desirable characteristic or character trait. Having a sense of humor, an expression that was first coined in the 1840s, became widely valued as a distinctively American personality attribute in the 1870s. Humor was viewed as a critical intellectual and social skill, the trait of a well-adjusted citizen, who understood, who was able to accommodate, to balance, to tolerate the multiple tensions of modern life. As a writer in Scribner's observed in 1914, having a sense of humor was, quote, the best lubricator for the machinery of civilized society because it eased the friction of many-sided human contacts. Laughter was a social lubricant, an acceptable affective response to conditions of stress and anxiety, conditions that might be met differently and more dangerously with unacceptable emotions like fear and anger. During the exceptionally stressful 1930s, humor came in multiple forms and took on multiple subjects, not least the subject of the Great Depression itself. Ballyhoo, a magazine that started in August of 1931 and met stunning success, a first issue run of 150,000 copies sold out in 3 days. By the end of 1931, it had a monthly circulation of over 2 million, which is really quite shocking. These are amazing circulation figures. Ballyhoo spoofed the fears of imminent American collapse that were repeatedly being intoned in other magazines, teasing its readers in its first issue editorial, whither, what next? The crisis? The people? Good times? What next? Blah, 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 blah. This might be the first time we see blah, 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 blah written in mass media, and so this is 1931. Grant Wood took a similarly sardonic tone in this really kind of strange typewritten note that we see on the right from November of 1931, in which he listed in a free verse Dada sort of style various business depressions from 1918 on, substituting the words from the first line with do down the page. It took me about half an hour. I was staring at this and staring at this, going, what the hell is this? And finally, I realized that the do-do-do-do-do's matched the words in the first line. But as I was doing that do-do-do-do-do, I realized there's sort of a scat singing sensibility to this piece. So, of course, I had to go Google when scat singing started. And sure enough, Louis Armstrong and Cab Calloway are coming up with scat singing, that use of sort of nonsense syllables and the sort of crisp intonation and rhythm, and they're doing so and making scat popular by the end of the 1920s. So it all fits. It's funny and it's odd and it's compelling. I think this sort of grabs us to ask, what's that about? Ballyhoo, the magazine, especially mocked the fantastic and overstated claims being made in 1930s advertising. Oh, good. I'm glad you're laughing. I think the one on the left is particularly odd. Using fake testimonials and quasi-familiar visuals to expose the techniques that advertisers use to dupe consumers into buying fraudulent and ridiculous products. From the crap of international radio, so that we can hear audiences gargle hot potatoes, etc., to on the right, extra-long bed sheets designed to fit snugly on park benches for those homeless nights, to wonderful little gadgets like the Smilette on the left. You're going to smile into prosperity by putting this on. I'm surprised we haven't reinvented this lately. And the ideal automobile for hard times on the right, the Zilch 8. As Margaret McFadden remarks, by presenting and then ridiculing a wide variety of dominant cultural conventions espoused by various figures of authority, Ballyhoo helped to organize popular common sense in the 1930s and encourage Americans to become more discerning consumers of products and politics alike. Grant Wood's sense of humor and use of humor was similarly engaged. Employed to encourage art audiences to develop a more mature, more critically attuned sense of cultural discernment regarding various American myths and mores. And I want to add that in the 1930s, the word ballyhoo really gained widespread use, in part because of the 1927 book published by journalist Silas Bent titled Ballyhoo, which was an expose of mass media sensationalism. But it also becomes, as we see here, the subject of Thomas Hart Benton's part of his mural that he originally made for the Whitney Museum in 1932. This is now in the New Britain Museum of American Art, in which he spoofed both political and intellectual figures and symbols, the eagle, the politician, various magazines like the New Masses and the New Republic. Ballyhoo was also the title of a very popular musical starring W.C. Fields and introducing a young Bob Hope in 1930 to vaudeville audiences. Humor was especially used in 1930s America as a form of emotional release and a national binding agent. As President Franklin Roosevelt remarked in 1933, "I sometimes think the saving grace of America lies in the fact that the overwhelming majority of Americans are possessed of two great qualities, a sense of humor and a sense of proportion." In the movies, humor ranged from the lunatic, vaudeville-inspired anarchy of the Marx Brothers to screwball comedies like My Man Godfrey, a fast-talking spoof of the nitwittery of high society. Many Americans focused on and flocked to see Shirley Temple, who in a decade full of glamorous movie stars like Jean Harlow and Joan Crawford was the top box office draw for 4 years in a row, from 1935 to 1938. Shirley Temple's popularity, explains John Casson, stemmed from her sense of humor and her smile, both of which met the emotional demands of a capitalist society in crisis. At his first inaugural address in 1933, FDR asserted his, quote, firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. A year later, the president urged Americans to counter their fears with Shirley Temple, saying, "When the spirit of the people is lower than at any other time during this depression, it is a splendid thing that for just 15 cents, an American can go to a movie and look at the smiling face of a baby and forget his troubles." Shirley's big screen breakthrough came in the 1934 movie, a musical comedy titled Stand Up and Cheer. And these movies that I'm talking about tonight are all available on YouTube. So if you don't want to Netflix binge Sons of Anarchy, which I've been doing lately, I'm ashamed to admit, you can watch these movies, and Stand Up and Cheer is one of the weirdest of them all. It concludes with this really surreal sequence of a Paul Revere figure riding a white horse across America in the clouds, galloping across the nation's farms and cityscapes, and then announcing as he lands in Manhattan that the Depression was, quote, officially over, there is no unemployment, fear has been banished, poverty has been wiped out, and the people are laughing again. This is 1934. The final scene of this movie shows Shirley Temple and a jovial parade of American farmers, policemen, nurses, milkmen, garbage men, cooks, maids, railroad porters, and more, all smiling and singing, "Stand up and cheer, banish all fear, we're out of the red." Marching through a triumphal arch featuring a gigantic eagle, a reference to the Blue Eagle of the National Recovery Administration, a New Deal agency established in 1933 to set codes of fair labor practices and to regulate consumer prices. The movie's forced optimism is just a little bit creepy. Hollywood's version of Triumph of the Will. Not surprisingly, left-wing critics were not amused. "The gist of this preposterous NRA propaganda musical," wrote one, "is that the Depression is a purely mental state, and mass campaigns of musical enlightenment are forthwith organized against poverty and misery. Such critics weren't wrong, of course. Many Americans tended to internalize the blame for their fears, persuaded that their bad feelings, their negative emotions, rather than the systemic imbalances of modern capitalism, were to blame for the Great Depression. If one of FDR's main objectives as president was to counter the grim emotional regime of the 1930s with a contagious sense of optimism, Shirley Temple's humor was similarly seen as a natural effusion of cheer and a welcome tonic and diversion at a time of national crisis. Stand Up and Cheer was based on a story by cowboy philosopher Will Rogers, an extremely popular humorist, radio personality, and actor whose 1933 movie State Fair, says James Dennis, was a favorite of movie lover Grant Wood. In the early 1930s, Will Rogers' wry sense of humor was often directed at big business privilege and exploitation, and in agrarian terms, as he quipped, "All the feed is going into one manger, and the stock on the other side of the stall ain't getting a thing." I think that's funny. When Wall Street Journal writers objected to his folksy taunts and his popularity, Rogers drew on his Cherokee ancestry, retorting, "I have a different slant on things, for my ancestors did not come over on the Mayflower. They met the boat." In State Fair, the first movie to be based on Phil Stong's best-selling 1932 novel about an Iowa farm family's week-long adventures at their state's annual exhibition, competition, and celebration of itself, Rogers' sense of humor identified Iowa as a place where culture was competitive and communal. An American character was constantly reinventing itself in accord with the inclusion of new people and new experiences. Focusing on the Frake family and featuring background shots of Iowa's 1932 fair in various scenes, the movie dramatized the merger of country and city types and taste in modern America. Will Rogers played Abel Frake, a farm patriarch, determined to win a blue ribbon for his beloved Blue Boy, a 900-pound hog played by the 1932 fair's actual grand champion boar, and apparently when filming ended, offered to Will Rogers, who demurred, saying, "I wouldn't feel right eating a fellow actor." Janet Gaynor played Abel's daughter Margie, bored to tears by her rural beaus and attracted at the fair to her geographic and ideological opposite, Pat, a citified newspaperman who calls Iowa's radical farmers the, quote, Bolsheviks of the Corn Belt, and wants to move to Chicago or New York to write the great American novel. In the background on the bottom, you can see some of the 1932 fair shots that were employed. In the end, the pig wins, the lovers kiss, attesting to how 1930s humor lubricated social frictions and brought people together. Well, not exactly everybody. Cultural critic Dwight MacDonald fumed, "At a time when the American farmer is faced with ruin, when the whole Middle West is seething with bitterness and economic discontent, a movie like State Fair is an insulting let-em-eat-cake gesture." Dwight MacDonald wanted State Fair to be a cinema verite documentary about radical politics in America's heartland, not a romantic comedy starring a 900-pound pig and featuring Will Rogers' radical regional reinvention of American character. Dwight MacDonald didn't get the movie. He didn't get its sense of humor, and he didn't get Iowa. Grant Wood got it, however. And State Fair may well have been one of Grant Wood's favorite movies because he identified in Will Rogers a like-minded humorist. Two, Iowa's State Fair had been very good to Grant Wood, In 1929, he won the grand prize at the fair's art salon for his portrait that we see here of John Turner. In 1930, he won that prize again and another for his portrait of Arnold Pyle and for Stone City. Soon thereafter, Stone City and American Gothic were selected for the annual exhibition of American painting at the Art Institute in Chicago, and Wood was established as sort of this new art world hero, or he was catapulted to art world fame. Writing hooray to Zenobia Ness, who became superintendent of the fair's art exhibits in 1928, Wood said, "The credit for my luck lay with her and the State Fair." As Chris Rasmussen observes, the Iowa State Fair's art salon was by far the most widely attended and well-publicized art exhibition in the state, and was in fact the only art gallery in which many Iowans ever set foot. It was the ideal place for Wood to reach a wide public audience with his humor-inflected American art. Reaching a wide public audience was the intent of many American artists in the 1930s, as per the New Deal's Art for the Millions agenda. And Grant Wood was very much on board with this agenda. In 1933, he was appointed head of the Midwest Division of the Public Works of Art Project, and tasked with supervising murals made for various buildings at Iowa State University in Ames. He also began making popular prints for the Associated American Artists, which sold Wood's lithographs for $5 each in department stores and by mail order. Organized in 1934, the AAA's smartly and successfully campaigns asserted the democratizing appeal of American art by promising consumers that they were not only getting, as you can see in these ads, not only getting a bargain, but helping to promote a uniquely American cultural enterprise guaranteed to elevate their standards of cultural awareness and taste. As the ad on the left from 1940 explains, why have America's leading artists made this sacrifice when they could normally get 3 to 8 times more for their works? Because they realize that the artist achieves his finest expression, attains a wider market, only when every cultured person, not just wealthy collectors, can afford a genuine original. Reaching that wide public audience with humor became a mandate among many in the 1930s, including American teachers. If the classroom had long been, and for some still is, a laughter-free zone focused on discipline, order, and authority, and I love this kid on the bottom right, somewhere in middle Wisconsin. In the 1930s, a progressive education movement promoted humor as a pedagogical tool that could encourage student love of learning and develop the student's sense of humor. Now, some of this upbeat emotional sensibility stemmed from the motivational posters produced in the 1920s by various American companies, such as Mather and Company in Chicago. These were work incentive visuals aimed at inculcating various values like teamwork, fairness, punctuality, self-worth, and cheerfulness. Educator Leon Ormond was a major proponent of what he called student mirth, advising in his 1941 book, Laugh and Learn, The Art of Teaching with Humor, that laughter was, quote, an instrument of modern maturation, a marvelously effective means of social growth in that it makes for self-confidence, poise, and adequate adjustment. For Grant Wood, whose teaching in the 1930s included those stints at the Stone City Art Colony, and then from 1933 through the early 1940s at the University of Iowa, humor and pedagogy went hand in hand. And we see him on the right talking with a student at the university at probably about 1939. That included poking fun at academia and himself. On the right, we see a pudgy Grant Wood sandwiched between two Dons, their lanky bodies aligned with the tall Gothic window in the rear, and his body looking ridiculously stunted. And this was at Lawrence University in Appleton, where he was awarded an honorary degree in 1938. I think, as we can tell from the photo on the left, they weren't too tall, and he wasn't so short. Wood's sense of humor was honed earlier, of course, including designing the so-called mourner's bench for naughty kids called to the principal's office at McKinley Junior High. Note the inscription, "The way of the transgressor is hard," alluding to the corporal punishment eked out in American public schools and the crying faces of the students carved on the post. Such benches, I want to point out, were also used in 19th century Christian revivals for repentant sinners. In Lilies of the Alley, Wood similarly made use or made light of religious references. Lilies of the Alley, Lily of the Valleys from the Song of Solomon, while poking fun at art and art making. His lily sculpture is much like the Baroness's Dada ready-made God, which featured a cast iron drain pipe turned upside down and mounted on a pedestal consisting of a wooden miter box. Wood's flower pot and junk assemblages, writes John Neff, parody both folk art and Dadaist icons. It's worth noting that Wood made these pieces while also imagining a Cedar Rapids artist colony that he jokingly called Greenwich Village of the Corn Belt. In this tiny brass self-portrait, Wood made fun of the all-seeing image of the artist, his image, by including glasses that hid rather than revealed his eyes, and as such corresponded with popular visual stereotypes of the blind that we can see on the postcard on the right. The punning terms of Wood's seeing, non-seeing self-portrait correlated further with the Dada art magazine, The Blind Man, which had a brief 2-issue run in 1917 and similarly interrogated the meaning of art and artist and who determined those meanings, especially in its coverage in the second issue of the Richard Mutt case and the rejection of Fountain from the exhibition at the Society of Independent Artists. As Jane Meloche writes, Wood gave 100 or so copies of this tiny brass self-portrait as Christmas presents to his friends, suggesting that he, like Marcel Duchamp, the Baroness, and the New York Dada artist, was eager to share his self-deprecating sense of humor with others. In his 1930s paintings, Wood employed humor to diffuse Depression-era anxieties and to foreground his ideas about a less restrictive, more egalitarian, and more culturally discerning American scene. He focused his sense of humor on several targets, including using the comedy of manners genre to parody the behaviors and affectations of American social class. Like 1930s screwball comedies, movies that poked fun at the social and sexual foibles of the idle rich and the well-born, Grant Wood's paintings like this one, Appraisal, the depiction of a sales transaction between a farm woman and a city woman, mediated class difference and class conflict with a humorous narrative of grudging acceptance and tolerance. Likewise, thrown together in the 1934 comedy It Happened One Night, spoiled rich girl Claudette Colbert and rogue newspaperman Clark Gable initially form an uneasy alliance. And if you've seen the movie, uneasy doesn't begin to describe it. They detest one another in the first half hour of the film. And then they discover, quote, things about the other that are admirable, including partnership. Wood also poked fun at social class in Daughters of Revolution, describing its 3 rather dim female subjects as those Tory gals, and calling the Daughters of American Revolution that clubby partisan clique that denounced his insulting picture and demanded its removal from public display via their claims to authentic American patriotism, denounced them as people who were trying to set up an aristocracy of birth in a republic. Grant Wood was hardly alone in his assessment of American entitlement, particularly during a decade when class-conscious critiques of elite privilege were widespread in multiple media, in movies, in magazines like Ballyhoo, and in paintings. The controversy that Daughters of Revolution aroused, which we see referenced here in a few newspaper articles discussing its display in particular in Chicago during 1933 and 1934 during the World's Fair, indicate that Wood's painting struck a chord. Like American Gothic, its humor was almost immediately copied, becoming the fodder for other send-ups of American social class and elite leadership. Note on the bottom right the Sons of Peace cartoon from the Chicago Tribune, which, like Grant Wood's painting, similarly exposed the hypocrisy of American authority figures. Here in particular, the politicians and the diplomats who advocated for peace and profited from war. As mentioned, some of Wood's most pointed humor was directed at reflexive patriotism, the automatic chauvinism of pronouncements like "my country, right or wrong." Wood's concerns about knee-jerk patriotism related to his larger concerns about American historical consciousness, its lack on the one hand, and its lack of criticality on the other. As Lewis Mumford, cultural critic, observed in 1925, we Americans have always had an infirm sense of history. To us, the past is simply the immediate precursor to the present. It's something we are outliving, are slothing off, or getting beyond. The use of humor in Parson Weems' fable and The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere aimed at reclaiming American history on critically self-aware terms, on raising consciousness about the historical narratives that Americans choose to tell and believe, like Paul Revere's Alarming Ride, in order to expose history's fundamentally invented or mythic sensibility. Like Constance Rourke, Wood understood American history as a record of and a tribute to the wide-ranging American inclination toward myth. His history paintings took jabs then at assumptions that history was truth, fact, and homage. Reducing Paul Revere to a fast-moving blip on that ribbon of concrete highway, and reducing his ride, as Wanda Korn relates, to a storybook tale, a piece of childhood fantasy, Wood prompted American viewers to rethink their infirm sense of history, to draw on his paintings' lighthearted irreverence and their own mature senses of humor in order to reach a position of detached discernment regarding the nation's myths and its values. His radical departure from older Arnoldian senses of culture as the best that has been thought and said in the world, and history as a creed of objectivity, followed other revisionist currents in the 1930s. In 1940, his subtly seditious ideas about humor, history, and teaching were widely publicized when scores of newspapers printed a press release that he had written about his painting of Episcopal priest Mason Locke Weems, who invented the cherry tree myth in the 5th edition of his hugely popular book, The Life of George Washington. As Wood remarked, it's a good thing that we are wiser today and recognize historical fact from historical fiction. Still, when we begin to ridicule the story of George and the cherry tree, and we quit teaching it to our children, something of color and imagination departed from American life. It is this something that I'm interested in helping to preserve. As I see it, the most effective way to do this is frankly to accept these historical tales for what they are now known to be: folklore. I sincerely hope that this painting will help reawaken interest in the cherry tree tale and other bits of American folklore that are too good to lose. It's a statement, I think, that really reveals Wood's long-standing interest in American art as education and humor as a learned tool, a critical component of a well-formed American character. Yet, his use of humor earlier in the 1930s was predicated on enlightening Americans about the fundamentally invented nature of their history and their character. And his recovery of this particular bit of American myth, explains Cecile Whiting, was aimed at fortifying American patriotism in the rise of the fascist threat. In 1939, when Wood painted Parson Weems' fable, the drum rolls for US entry in another global war were sounded louder and louder, and reflexive nationalism returned full force. Class-conscious critiques were replaced by pronouncements of American classlessness, and humor became the graphic condemnation of others, as in the satirical World War II poster showing Hitler's brain full of Monopoly-like tokens, powder kegs, guns, cannons, snakes, rats, etc., not the detached discernment of Americans laughing at themselves in order to make themselves and to make America better. As Grant Wood himself cautioned, in our present unsettled times, when democracy is threatened on all sides, the preservation of our folklore is more important than is generally realized. From the beginning to the end of the Great Depression, Grant Wood's use of humor was noticed, critiqued, and then denied. In September of 1942, for example, just 7 months after the artist died, the Cedar Rapids Gazette informed its readers that American Gothic was, quote, finally recognized as the sympathetic yet realistic portrayal that the artist intended it to be. I think that this was a complete reversal of Wood's own remarks about the painting, about his interest in the faults and fanaticism of American character, and in the affective nuances and broad possibilities, social, political, cultural, of American humor. But Grant Wood's sense of humor didn't jibe with the changed emotional conditions of 1940s America. Wartime demanded a sense of serious commitment and unquestioned consensus from Americans who didn't doubt, let alone snicker at, national purpose, who didn't make fun of the fantastic inventions of American history. Reassessed as a dangerously naive regionalist during the war years and after, Wood was dismissed himself, and his playful, self-critical, and nationally reconstructive sense of humor was forgotten. So it's been a pleasure for me tonight to hopefully revive and reinterpret it here for you this evening. Thank you.
So I found this stuff hilarious. I really enjoyed it.
You keep your laughter quiet, though.
No, I'm glad. One of the things that I found really interesting about the juxtaposition of his paintings with screwball comedies, which I found really convincing. But at the same time, I can't help but get from the Grant Wood paintings, the sort of laughter that it elicits is a different. It's not the kind of like guttural kind of bodily. There's that great William James line about how we're not happy because we laugh, or how's it go? It's like we are not happy. We are happy when we laugh. Sorry, I'm messing that up. But there's a kind of like bodily component to trying to get that laugh out, right?
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily get that from the Grant Wood paintings, and I wonder if that also is as a failure of the humor to kind of come
Oh, I think that's a
through.
really good point, and I agree. We go to the movies, and typically in the movies we're able to laugh, cry. I mean, this is an emotional space, right? But we go to art galleries, and we see art, and if you laugh in front of a painting, that, you might be called out or something. Art's supposed to be serious stuff. And of course, he's all about challenging that kind of high and low cultural hierarchy. But I do agree with you. There's something very different about being in a movie theater and being in an art gallery. But I think he's still trying to get people to understand a chuckle, a laugh, and then use that as an instrument of reflection, of self-reflection, and then push it into the national sphere. So that's a good comment. I agree. There are different kinds of humor, different kinds of humorous spaces. And of course, not everybody laughed. Not everybody shared the Grant Woodian sense of humor, which was also part of the controversy over so many of his paintings. Yes?
Clearly, you are not saying that all of his work is humorous.
No, I'm not. I didn't show more than a handful of his works. Some of them are very serious, as portraits of children and others. I don't think the portrait of John Turner has humor in it. I don't know.
I mean, something like that is not humorous.
I think that's humorous.
To me, it is not.
Okay, all right. We're Americans and we can disagree. So why don't you think that's funny?
Well, I don't think it's funny.
Yeah.
To me, it was very realistic.
Okay. But realistic can't be funny?
Hopefully not.
All right. Because what I think he's trying to do is take realism and play around with that and say, well, why do you trust that? Why is that real for you? What are the boundaries between real and surreal? What would make it funny? What would make it not believable? What would I have to do as an artist to get you to laugh or chortle? And I laugh and chortle because I look at the concrete highway in the middle of this space and the over-electrified space at the outside, et cetera, et cetera. It also looks like a sort of toy train set ensemble. And I consider that humorous when I think about other landscapes painted by other American artists, et cetera. So, he might be, to go back to the first question, expecting his audiences to have a particular understanding of visual culture as well. But I think he's pulling it out from a variety of different visual sources. Yes?
So how many other artists at the same timeline were creating works of art that were somewhat cartoonish?
In the 1930s?
Playful at the same timeline.
Yeah.
That had a wonderful twisted sense of humor. That you can think of.
In the 1930s? Lots.
How many?
I-
Name another.
Thomas Hart Benton.
Outside of Benton.
Yeah.
Outside of
Peggy
Work.
Bacon.
Okay.
Doris Lee.
Okay.
Minna Citron. Who else has helped me out here, guys?
Was it really Norman Rockwell University?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. He's just getting started at this
It's
point.
just getting started.
Yeah. For me, his humor is
Who
particularly
else?
post-war.
Who else?
You gonna grill me here?
You're on a path to exploring this whole thing.
I
so-
am exploring.
All right. You know,
There's a lot of cartoonists on the left who are doing
that were
post-war
actually
humor.
shown in galleries. We have to limit it to
Sure.
galleries.
I mean, Rocker's doing stuff for newspapers, and he's also being shown in galleries. He's
Okay.
also painting murals. So,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, that's a good point. People are switching back and forth in media and also in gallery spaces, exhibition spaces. I think your question's great because what you're saying is how much humor is there in the 1930s, and
Well, then you
I think
flip
of
it
it a
over
lot.
to others that were some of the great photographers at the same
Mm-hmm.
time that were actually depicting people downtrodden, they're down on the level. And it's, we've got a lot of great photography at the same time.
Right.
It's contrast, it's whole experience.
Yeah, I mean, humor isn't at the top of the list for the FSA mandate. It's got to be a little bit more serious, considering that the goal of New Deal photography is to get funding, right?
Right.
And if you poke fun too much,
Right.
you go over the line, Congress isn't going to support the program. But then you get a picture, and I think somebody's talking about this tomorrow, Gordon Parks's 1942 picture of a cleaning woman in Washington posed in the guise of American Gothic. That is funny to us now, and I think it was also funny in 1942. It was dangerously funny. So their humor is employed especially in advertising, in cartoons, in films. I don't know if there's a lot of humor in straight-up photography. It's a good question.
I haven't seen it. Pretty serious.
Wanda.
What do you think, well, let me just back up and make a statement and say that if you look at Grant Wood's first 10, 15 years worth of work before he turns into a regionalist, so to speak, they're not funny, are they?
The paintings?
Yeah, the paintings. I'm just trying to think of still lifes, landscapes.
I think that some of the design work that I showed is funny.
Some of the which work?
Like the little portrait, the Dada
Well, I
stuff.
think he did a lot of things in his personal life that were funny, like the lilies of the alley, I guess.
Right. I also think that the drawings that he proposed for a mural with the Native American figure,
Yes.
I think those are funny.
Yeah.
I didn't really look at a lot of the drawings beforehand. I think he's exploring, I think he's playing around. It would be interesting to talk to folks who have written about or have access to information about how he was in the classroom, what kind of teacher he was. He seems to have been that kind of teacher that got kids engaged and enthused and involved in projects. That meant he had a good sense of humor.
Yeah, he was kind of Peter Pan, I think. He was a real, he enjoyed teaching and they enjoyed him as a
Right,
teacher. But
right.
to get to getting into his last 10 years of work, somehow he got the confidence to let, because he was a very funny person, we know that. And his sister was also a very funny person, ran in the family genes, at least for the two of them. And somehow he must have felt confident that he could take his craft and
Sure.
make humor a part of it. So I'm wondering who else besides the kinds of filmic and culture, but do you have Mark Twain in here, for instance? Do we know anything about
I don't know
his
anything
love of
about
other humorists?
Yeah, I don't know anything about whether or not he's reading or knows about Mark Twain, but I'm assuming he does. He's fairly well read.
Sinclair Lewis, for sure.
For sure. I mean, he illustrates Main Street. I think that the success that he has at the State Fair and then at the Art Institute, and he knows he's on to something, and that's when it all starts. And he, of course, had this idea of doing a lot more history paintings. He wanted to do Pocahontas. He had a whole bunch of historical follies that he wanted to play around with. That would have been great, but he didn't get there. He went into the AAA for money. He has conflicted personal life. That takes up time, and he was a pretty slow painter. So as we know, he just didn't paint a lot.
He was
Except
generous
for
with his time.
He was generous with his time with other people, to be sure. Yeah, he was teaching.
Technically painting.
Yeah. Yes.
Actually, I think you did know Mark Twain because I think he wrote a short commentary on Isaiah Kim. But my question is, I think one of the things that we learn about the character of humor is that it's the flip side of tragedy. And I see Wood often as a deeply conflicted person who had great affection for this region, the people with whom he grew up. But he also had a considerable level of depression and disappointment about his role as an artist, in society. So, it makes me wonder, was his humor, do you suppose it was his way of integrating, assimilating, overcoming his innate disappointment?
Probably all of those things.